We're just looking into this topic and problem of people with dementia getting lost in the community. But before I begin, I just want to say a big thank you to the Earl and Stewart Charitable Trust, who are the funders of my PhD. So without their financial backing and without their financial support, none of the research that I have done and that I will present to you in this presentation would have been possible. So I just want to say a big thank you to the trust. But yeah, I'm just going to jump straight into the presentation. So I'll start off by giving you all a quick background on what Alzheimer's disease is. So Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative disease that is the most common cause of dementia in individuals above 65 years of age. Now, the disease is characterized by the formation of these amyloid beta plaques, as well as neurofibrillary tangles that appear throughout key regions of the brain. And what these plaques and tangles actually do is they basically trigger and cause the loss of nerve cells in key regions of the brain. And this often leads affected individuals to suffer from a progressive loss to their cognitive abilities. Now, these plaques and tangles first appear in regions of the brain that function in memory as well as spatial navigation. So you often find that affected individuals suffer from early impairments to both of these cognitive abilities in particular. But of relevance to my talk today, I will be focusing specifically on the cognitive ability of spatial navigation. Now, before I speak a little bit about how spatial navigation is affected in Alzheimer's disease, it's important for us to first look at how the brain normally functions in spatial navigation. And this very nicely brings us into the spatial navigation center of the brain. So, as shown in the figure over here, the spatial navigation center of the brain is actually composed of 3 different brain regions, broadly speaking, and each brain region functions in a different aspect of navigation. So the first brain region, which is colored or labeled in blue, is the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe functions in what's known as landmark-based navigation. Now, landmark-based navigation is whereby we use landmarks to orient ourselves within the environment, as well as to inform various navigation turns that need to be made. So if you read this quote that I've written over here, so I need to turn right at the post box, is a classic real-world example whereby we use landmark-based navigation. Now, the second brain region that's a part of the center is the medial temporal lobe, which is colored in red. And what the medial temporal lobe does is it functions in map-based navigation. Now, map-based navigation is whereby we generate and use these internal maps that contain an overview of our environment. And a classic real-world example whereby we use map-based navigation is when we take alternative routes, such as shortcuts, to get to particular locations. But you often find that in everyday life, we rarely ever use purely one type of navigation strategy or the other, but we rather use a combination of both types of strategies. And this is made possible by the final brain region in the center, which is colored in purple, and this is the retrosplenial cortex. And as I just mentioned, this brain region functions in the interplay between landmark and map-based navigation. So that is how we navigate from a neuroscience and from a brain level perspective. But how is spatial navigation actually affected in Alzheimer's disease? Now, to answer this question, researchers have in recent years taken advantage of the advent of virtual reality testing, whereby they've taken people with dementia, put them in virtual reality environments, and tested out their navigational abilities. And there's been a lot of studies that have actually been conducted using this approach and in this domain. And overall, what the results of these studies tell us is that people with dementia exhibit impairments in all aspects of their spatial navigation abilities. So landmark-based navigation, map-based navigation, and the interaction between the two. And I'd also like to add here that recent work from our lab and from our team has shown that navigation impairments actually occur well before the clinical onset of dementia, as they can actually be seen in individuals at a high genetic risk of dementia who haven't yet progressed into having the disease. So from a neuroscience perspective, we understand really well how spatial navigation is affected in Alzheimer's disease. particularly with regards to it being a cognitive ability that is impaired quite early on in the disease process. But what we don't have such a good understanding of is what actually are the real world consequences of these spatial navigation impairments. Now, previous studies have suggested that due to these spatial navigation impairments, people with dementia can often make various navigation errors when they're out and about and navigating in the community. And this basically results in them getting lost in the community, both in unfamiliar environments as well as in familiar environments with the progression of the disease. Now, in terms of statistics, it's been reported that up to 70% of people with dementia get lost at least once over the course of the disease. And of course, you have a small group of individuals that get lost multiple times as well. And it's also been reported that up to 40,000 people with dementia go missing for the first time every year in the UK. And this number in particular is likely to increase with the projected increase in the dementia person population, not only in the UK, but more generally worldwide. So as can be seen, getting lost is one of the earliest and most distressing symptoms seen in people with dementia. And it's a symptom that is quite unpredictable in its onset and in its nature. But despite being quite unpredictable, studies have shown that there are patterns to people getting lost. So specifically, there's three main common situations where a getting lost episode can occur for a person with dementia. The first situation is during routine activities. So for example, when the person with dementia goes on a routine daily neighborhood walk. The second situation is when they are temporarily left unsupervised. So for example, when the person with dementia is waiting somewhere for their carer. And the third and final most common situation is at nighttime when the carer is sleeping. So what happens here is the person with dementia leaves the house at night, they get lost, and they're unable to find their way back. So these are three different and three unique situations where a person with dementia can get lost. But what we can actually learn from this is that a getting lost episode is likely to occur for a person with dementia when they are alone and or when they are not supervised by the carer. Now on this slide over here, I've listed some of the main consequences of people with dementia getting lost in the community. So for the person with dementia themselves, getting lost can greatly increase their chances of being admitted to a care home by up to 7 times, studies have shown. And this in particular can bring about with it lots of difficulty, especially if the person expresses a strong desire to still stay at home. It can also cause them to suffer from a reduced sense of autonomy as they're monitored more meticulously by their carers, either in formal settings or in informal settings. And these getting lost episodes greatly increases the chances of people with dementia sustaining various injuries. And in the worst case scenarios, they can die from it as well. Now, for the carers, having to routinely deal with people with dementia getting lost greatly increases their burden and distress. And people with dementia getting lost in the community triggers the increasing involvement of community search resources, as well as law enforcement groups such as the police. And there's a lot of financial costs and implications that are associated with this as well. So overall, you can see that getting lost is not just a prevalent problem for the people with dementia themselves, but also for their carers and, more generally speaking, the wider community in which they live in. So this then leads us to this question of why do people with dementia actually get lost in the community in the first place? Now, if you look at this from a neuroscience perspective, we know from the various virtual reality studies that have been conducted that people with dementia suffer from early impairments to their spatial navigational abilities. But a major drawback or a major kind of limitation of these studies is that you often find that most of the environments that are employed in these VR studies lack the vividness and complexity of real-world settings. And the tasks that are used in these studies often don't represent the daily navigation challenges faced by people with dementia when they're out and about and navigating in the community. So as such, whilst knowledge gained from these studies are useful in itself, the extent to which this knowledge can be used to understand and answer this question of why people with dementia get lost in the community is at present still poorly understood. Now, to truly answer this question, you very much need to investigate and explore this concept from a real-world perspective, which is what my PhD research has tried to do. Now, in the real world, our successful navigation is not only determined by our own internal brain navigation factors, but also on the external environment around us and how we interact with the environment around us. So as such, it's being suggested that it may very well be the combination of spatial navigation impairments and specific environmental factors that may actually be leading to people with dementia getting lost in the community. So this led us to our first research question of interest, which was what environmental risk factors actually contribute to people with dementia getting lost? And to try and answer this question, we conducted a police data study, which I'll speak about in the next couple of slides. So in this police data study, we conducted a study in collaboration with the Norfolk Police. And for those of you that aren't tuning in locally, Norfolk is the name of the county in which we're based in. And the Norfolk Police provided us with their case records of missing people with dementia. So a total of 210 different cases were provided to us, spanning a total of 3 years. So all these cases covered dates from January 2014 to December 2017. And what we wanted to do with these case records was we first of all wanted to identify if there's any spatial hotspots in the Norfolk region that individuals may be more likely to go missing from. And the second thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to explore the spatial configurations of the locations that individuals went missing from to try and identify if there's any potential environmental risk factors in these regions that may be underlying these missing incidents. So we first went about trying to identify hotspots for missing incidents in our county. And for this, the first thing we did was we plotted out the locations that different individuals went missing from onto a map of the Norfolk County as shown in the figure over here. Now, there were a total of 168 different locations that individuals went missing from. And after taking into account the different population densities across the whole county, we then conducted a hotspot analysis. And what our results from the hotspot analysis show us is that there were in fact no hotspots or cold spots for that matter for missing individuals with dementia in the Norfolk region. Now, what this result suggests and tells us is that missing incidents are a widespread and prevalent problem for people with dementia in the Norfolk region and beyond as well. And it also further strengthens the notion that getting lost is endemic and therefore an integral part of the disease process, as opposed to being a direct factor of the environment. So what this means is that if you have dementia, it doesn't matter where you live, it doesn't matter where you are, you still exhibit some risk of actually getting lost. The next thing that we did was for each of the 168 different locations, we kind of investigated the spatial makeup or the spatial configurations of these locations. So put simply, for each of the 168 locations, we generated a buffer zone that had a radius of 1 kilometer, and we looked at the presence of the following variables in these buffer zones. So we looked at the number of outdoor landmarks in these regions, the number of road intersections and the complexity of the road intersections. And the last thing we looked at was what the overall road layouts in these regions were. And just very briefly, the reason why we chose to look at these three variables in particular is very simply because these three variables play a big role in influencing and guiding our navigation behavior in the outside world. And what our results showed us was that the locations where people with dementia went missing from had an increased presence of outdoor landmarks, had a high density of road intersections, and the road intersections tended to be quite complex in their structure and nature. And the last thing we found was that the road layouts in these regions had irregular patterns, which means that they were less grid-like and more circuitous in their structure. So in a nutshell, what our results are telling us here is that the above three variables may represent potential environmental risk factors for dementia-related missing incidents. Now, the results of this study in particular has implications in three different domains. So from a research perspective, very little is actually known about what environmental risk factors may contribute to people with dementia getting lost. And with this study, we here present evidence for the very first time that the increased presence of landmarks and complex road network structure may be potential environmental risk factors for this. Now, from a clinical perspective, our results have implications in safeguarding, whereby it may especially be beneficial for individuals with dementia to be encouraged to take routes with fewer landmarks and fewer intersections on independent journeys, if and when possible, to very simply try and reduce the risk of them actually getting lost. Now, beyond the clinic, our results also have implications in the informing of dementia-friendly town and village planning, especially with regards to starting up conversations on how can we plan the distribution and placement of landmarks and plan the complexity of road network structures in areas that have a high density of people living with dementia, so that we can make these areas more navigation friendly, not only for the people with dementia themselves, but for the wider community that live there as a whole. So in summary, the police data study introduced us and helped us identify built features of the environment that may contribute to people getting lost. But beyond looking at built features of the environment, another thing that we were interested in was to kind of investigate how people with dementia actually move in the outdoor environment and how they interact with the outdoor environment. And specifically, how do these movement patterns differ from the outdoor movement patterns of people without dementia? As looking into this variable in particular could potentially offer us further insight into why these people are getting lost in the first place. And to answer this question, we conducted our second study, which was a GPS movement tracking study. Now, in this GPS movement tracking study, what we did was we recruited a total of 15 people that had a clinical diagnosis of dementia, who were still residing in the community. And we also recruited a total of 18 age-matched people without dementia, who were also living in the community. And we gave all participants of this research study a GPS tracker, and we basically tracked their movement patterns, outdoor movement patterns, I should say, for a period of 2 weeks. Now, using this 2-week GPS trajectories, we looked at 5 key outdoor movement variables that are listed on this slide over here. So the first variable we looked at was outings made per day. So very simply put, how often are individuals getting outdoors in the first place? The second thing we looked at was time spent moving outside home per outing. So once outside, how long are individuals actually spending outdoors? Distance covered per outing is pretty self-explanatory. So we looked at the total distance covered, as well as distance covered purely by foot. Average distance traveled from home per outing. So whenever individuals go outside, are they staying quite close to home or are they venturing further away? And lastly, similarity of routes taken across outings. So are individuals sticking to the same and familiar routine routes, or are they a bit more adventurous in their route taking? So we looked at all of these variables firstly, for people without dementia, and we looked at all of these variables across all outings that they made. Now, for people with dementia, we expect their outdoor movement patterns to look quite different when they are alone compared to when they're accompanied. as a result of their navigation impairments and more generally as a result of their cognitive impairments. So to highlight these differences and to explore these differences more, we split the data of the people with dementia into outings alone, as well as into outings accompanied. And overall, what we did was we compared all three groups on their outdoor movement variables. And yeah, the results will be presented on the next slide. So our results showed us that the movement patterns of people with dementia on outings accompanied were similar to people without dementia. But the movement patterns of people with dementia on outings alone were quite different to when they were accompanied and quite different to the people without dementia. So specifically, people with dementia on outings alone made less nighttime outings, spent less time moving outdoors per outing. They covered a total of lower distance compared to the other two groups. They tended to stay close to home in their outings. And lastly, they also tended to use similar and familiar routes in their outdoor movement. So overall, what our results show us or tell us over here is that people with dementia when alone have restricted and limited outdoor movement patterns. So that was the first thing, or our first finding in this GPS movement tracking study. Now, the second thing that we wanted to do with this rich data that we collected was we wanted to test out the results of the police data study and try and see if we could validate the results of that study. So here, what we're trying to do is we are trying to answer this question of, do people with dementia actually get lost in areas with increased landmarks and complex road network structure? So yeah, again, we used the same sample of individuals with dementia and without dementia, and we looked at their 2-week GPS trajectories, this time from more of a geospatial angle. Now, the first thing that we noticed, or the first thing that we found, was that the people with dementia in our sample didn't actually have any explicit getting lost episodes during this 2-week tracking period. But what they had instead was more subtle moments of spatial disorientation. So this pretty much refers to instances where individuals felt a little bit confused and when they were more generally a bit unsure of their whereabouts. So using this information, we split up our people with dementia into two different groups. So the first group was people with dementia who had disorientation during the tracking period, and there was a total of 6 individuals that fell within this group. And the second group was people with dementia that had no disorientation, and there was a total of 9 individuals in that group. And what we did was we compared the trajectories of both groups of individuals. And here we were trying to answer this question of, do the trajectories of individuals who had disorientation pass through areas that had a high landmark density and complex road network structure? And could these environmental variables actually explain why these individuals felt disoriented in the first place? Now, what our results showed us was that the trajectories of both groups actually, in fact, passed through locations that were similar in their landmark density and road network structure. And this basically suggests that these environmental variables may not fully explain why some of these individuals had spatial disorientation during the tracking period. Now, immediately, you'll see that the results of this study disagree with the results of our police data study. And there's two main reasons why we think this is the case. So the first reason is due to lower sample size. So in this study, we only had 6 disoriented people with dementia compared to the relatively larger sample of 210 disoriented individuals who went missing in the police data study. And because our sample size is very small over here, there are some limitations as to the types of conclusions that we can draw from this data. And the second reason for this discrepancy is due to a lack of clarity on specific locations where the people with dementia felt disoriented. Now, we unfortunately didn't have access to this information in this study, which is why we looked at their entire 2-week GPS trajectories. Now, had we had access to this information and had we looked at specific locations where these people felt disoriented, we might have seen potential environmental effects that were more in line with our police data study. But that's just speculation at this point, and we don't know this for sure. So were we able to answer this question that we set out to answer? Not entirely, but what we can recommend is for future research to be conducted that addresses this problem with a relatively larger sample size of disoriented people with dementia, as well as with a more fine-grained analysis on the specific locations that individuals felt disoriented, to try and see if these factors actually play a role in causing them to feel disoriented. So in summary, the main finding and the most interesting finding that we found from the movement tracking study was that people with dementia on outings alone tend to make restricted and tend to have limited outdoor movement. Now, although this doesn't exactly tell us why people with dementia get lost in the first place, what it does tell us is that this type of behavior is likely to reflect safeguarding measures that are put in place by either these individuals themselves or their carers to prevent getting lost episodes from happening in the future. Now, whilst this may seem like a sensible approach on paper, it may not actually be the most appropriate response, as one important thing that we need to remember is that not all of these individuals may actually be at a high risk for getting lost in the community. And the second thing that we need to take into account is that having restricted outdoor movement can actually have a negative impact on the autonomy and independence of people with dementia. Now, ideally, we want people with dementia to enjoy as much independence or exhibit as much functional independence as they possibly can, whilst still being cautious that they may be at risk for getting lost in the community. Or in other words, what we need to do is we need to strike this fine balance between their right to safety as well as their right to autonomy. Now, this isn't a simple thing to do to strike this balance. It can be quite tricky, but an important first step that we can take to help us achieve this balance is to first of all try and see if we can actually identify which individuals are especially at a high risk for getting lost. And to address this question, we conducted a virtual reality / real world navigation study. Now, the objective of this VR real-world navigation study was to investigate the spatial navigation of people with dementia in virtual reality settings, as well as in real-world settings. So for this study, we used the same sample of people with and without dementia as the movement tracking study. And what we did was we first tested out their spatial navigation abilities in using these classical VR navigation tests. And we followed this up by testing out their navigation abilities in the real world by conducting these outdoor neighborhood navigation tests in their own neighborhood. Now, based on the people with dementia's performance on this second test in particular, we divided them into two different groups. So individuals with dementia who got lost relatively more on the outdoor test was put into a high risk for getting lost group, and individuals who got lost relatively less in the outdoor test was put into the low risk for getting lost group. And the main question that we're trying to answer here was, do individuals who get lost more in the outdoor test perform differently on the VR tests than those who got lost less? Or in other words, can the VR navigation tests be used to potentially predict who is at high risk for getting lost in the real world? Now, unfortunately, we haven't finished analyzing the results of this study, so I won't be able to present the results of the study to you guys today. But what I can speak about is a little bit about what the more wide-ranging implications and what the more wide-ranging impact of the study can actually be in looking at this topic. So in terms of the impact of this study, from a research perspective, earlier on in my presentation, I basically argued that the extent to which spatial navigation impairments measured using VR tests can be used to explain why people with dementia get lost in the real world is at present still poorly understood. But we envision that the results of this study will go some way into helping address this question a little bit more. And more importantly, the results of the study will very much tie in the neuroscience side of things as well as the real world side of things, which at present is pretty much lacking in the scientific literature. But more so than a research perspective, we envision that the results of the study will have a much wider impact, clinically speaking, specifically with regards to the fact that these VR tests can be used in the clinic, whereby clinicians can administer this test to people with dementia who present with symptoms in the clinic at diagnosis stage. And based on the person with dementia's performance on the VR tests, the clinician can then make an assessment as to how likely it would be for this individual to get lost in the real world. Now, for individuals that exhibit and demonstrate themselves as being at a relatively higher risk for getting lost, more safeguarding strategies and mechanisms can be put in place, thereby giving more importance to their right to safety than to their right to autonomy. And on the flip side of the coin, for individuals who exhibit or demonstrate relatively lower risk for getting lost in the real world, less safeguarding mechanisms can be put in place. So in essence, giving more importance and more weightage to their right to autonomy than to their right to safety. So speaking about safeguarding, we've reached the final part of my presentation where we tried to answer this question of how do we effectively safeguard against people with dementia getting lost in the community? And to help us answer this question, we conducted a systematic review which looked at interventions that are currently used to safeguard against this problem. And we tried to see if there was any, or we tried to determine if there was any interventions that were considered to be more effective for this. So the objective of the systematic review was to review and determine the effectiveness of currently used interventions to prevent people with dementia getting lost or exiting premises, with the overarching view and overarching aim that knowledge gained from this study can contribute to evidence-based guidelines for safeguarding. So in our review, we found that there were a total of 25 studies that looked into safeguarding against this problem, which isn't a lot actually from a research perspective. But the interventions that were used across these studies can quite broadly be classified into two different groups. So on the one hand, you have interventions that are designed to prevent people with dementia from exiting a premise in the first place, so taking upon a more proactive approach. And on the other side, you have interventions that are designed to facilitate the retrieval of missing individuals after an event of getting lost, so taking upon a more reactive approach. Now, interventions to prevent exiting were mainly visual barriers and alarm systems. So what visual barriers are is basically they function to conceal exit doors in various properties. And in doing so, they prevent the person with dementia from, first of all, seeing the exit door, and second of all, going over to the exit door, interacting with it, and all of a sudden leaving the property. And on the other hand, what alarm systems do is they very simply sound an alarm, and this alerts the carer or other individuals in the vicinity that a person with dementia has left the facility or property in essence. Interventions to facilitate retrieval were very simply GPS devices or variations of GPS devices. And GPS devices, as you all may know, function to provide location information that the carer can then use to go and retrieve the missing individual in the event that they had gotten lost. But one thing that I need to stress about GPS devices is, quite surprisingly, there were no studies that actually looked at the effectiveness of GPS devices in safeguarding against this problem. The studies that mentioned GPS devices were more looking at the acceptability and feasibility of using GPS devices for this problem as seen by people with dementia themselves or by their relatives and carers as well. So for each of these 25 studies, we carried out a risk of bias check. So we assessed their internal validity. And we did this across various different domains, but mainly in study design, how they measured the effects of the intervention and how they reported the results as well. And for each of the studies, we gave an overall risk of bias score, which ranged from low to moderate to serious to critical. And what the results of our systematic review showed us was that almost all studies had critical or serious risks of bias overall. And as such, unfortunately, they don't provide any sufficient evidence to help us determine which one of these interventions is actually more effective. It's not all doom and gloom, however, as I mentioned earlier on, there weren't any studies that looked at the effectiveness of GPS devices for safeguarding against people getting lost. Now, GPS devices seem like a great solution on paper, but their effectiveness actually needs to be tested out systematically in the future. Now, on top of GPS devices, more wide-scale interventions currently exist and or are being developed. And I've picked out two ones in particular to share with you all in this presentation. So the first wide-scale intervention is this MedicAlert safe return program, which is based in the US. And what this is it's an emergency response service for missing people with dementia. And a report that had been published that was looking at the effectiveness of this intervention reported that this response service had facilitated the return of 11,200 missing individuals. This was a couple of years ago, so as of 2020, this number is likely to be much higher. Now, more locally in the UK, specifically in Scotland, there's this new initiative known as the Purple Alert. And the Purple Alert is a mobile app that is designed to increase public awareness of missing individuals with dementia if and when a missing incident actually occurs. So again, these are promising solutions on paper, but future research is urgently required to determine the true effectiveness of these interventions to see if they help prevent people with dementia from getting lost in the community. So just to close off my talk, and in conclusion, there's three take-home messages from my research. The first take-home message is that increased outdoor landmark density and complex road network structure may be potential environmental risk factors that contribute to people with dementia getting lost. We found that people with dementia, when alone, tend to exhibit restricted and limited outdoor movement, and there's an urgent need for us to actually identify which one of these individuals is actually at a high risk for getting lost. And lastly, GPS devices may offer a promising solution for safeguarding against this problem, but future research is needed to confirm this. So thank you all for listening to my talk. I am happy to take questions now, and if you're a little bit shy, you can also contact me via this email over here.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vaisakh. If you could stop your presentation then. Excellent. Thank you very much. So we have time for questions. I'm just having a look at the chat if we have any questions. I think the first one was about the copies of the presentation. So we're actually recording the presentation. So by the link we'll send later, you can actually access the presentation at any time via this link at your leisure and go through it again, and also Vaisakh's talk. Then I think we have a question from Josie Tailfoot. Were all your participants at a similar stage of Alzheimer's disease when you compared how many did and did not become disorientated? Vaisakh, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, sure. So thanks for that question, Josie. So we didn't exactly do any check on hardcore staging of our participants. So in general, what we wanted to do was we just wanted to look at people with dementia living in the community as a whole, regardless of background and regardless of clinical staging. and look at their movement patterns and try and identify which one of these individuals may actually be at a high risk for getting lost. But from a science perspective, yes, it is very important to look at staging. And yeah, future studies should look at how these getting lost patterns vary with staging and how different environmental risk factors affect people at different stages of the disease.
Just to add to this, I think there is previous research from the US mostly showing that at the beginning of the disease, there's usually less getting lost episodes, then they increase, and then they decrease again. The reason why they decrease is that at later stages, very often people are not let out again, or they're in care homes, which usually have a much more restricted, of course, that people can't get out anymore. But it's a very, very good question in terms of disease stage. When are people at the highest risk in particular? Right, I have another question from Sapna Nuntrol. She asks, how do you define landmarks?
Yeah, so for the purpose of our study, what we used a publicly available outdoor landmark data set. And in brief, a landmark was defined in this data set as any object or location that was quite broadly classified into 5 different groups. So you had amenity and leisure landmarks, which are things like pubs, restaurants, fitness centers, etc. You had historic landmarks, things like statues and so forth. Tourist landmarks, which vary from town to town. Urban and rural furniture, so things like bus stops, billboards, benches, etc. And the last thing that you had was, let me try and see if I can remember this, was so urban and rural furniture, tourist, transport, traffic and transport landmarks. So things like zebra crossings, traffic lights, parking lots, things like that. So quite broadly speaking, these were the things that we defined as outdoor landmarks for the study.
Yeah, landmarks are complex, obviously. There are many landmarks around.
Which is also why we didn't further subdivide our results into the type of landmark, because there is an air of subjectivity around it. So what's a landmark to me might not be a landmark to someone else. And what's a historic landmark to me might not be what's a historic landmark to someone else. So that's why we didn't further subdivide landmarks into different categories, and we just looked at outdoor landmarks as a whole.
So we have another question from Samuel Lawrence. How do you determine when people with dementia will experience moments of disorientation during the tracking study?
Yeah, good question, Sam. And I probably should have mentioned this in the presentation, but what we did was, obviously, when we recruit the people with dementia, we recruit their carers as study partners as well. And during the study or after the tracking period, we just asked the carers to report whether there were any moments of disorientation during that tracking period. So we kind of had to take their word for that.
From Ellie Young, a question, what about pre-morbid reporting of orientation? So this means, I guess, before people had dementia, how was their orientation?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. But unfortunately, we couldn't look at that. So we only looked at pre-study participation reporting of orientation. So we looked at whether they had any getting lost episodes before they took part in our studies, which the majority of the people in our sample did. And we basically did some questionnaires where both the carers and the person with dementia themselves filled it out, which give us an indication into past history of orientation problems, as well as subjective ratings of how good they think their orientation is.
Just to add to this, this is a really interesting question in general, because of course, many people in the population, they say either that they're very good at navigation, and people say, I'm terrible at navigation. So this is a really interesting question, even for neuroscience, where in neuroscience, we can determine this much better. But how does this determine whether somebody is at high risk of getting lost is a question we can't answer yet, but it's a really, really interesting question. So next, we have another question from Josie Telford. It would be interesting to know, I guess it could be down to character that people also get disorientated. Those that have always enjoyed being outdoors are more likely to go out for walks.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So in my presentation, I touched upon two factors. So spatial navigation factors as well as environmental factors, but studies actually showed that there is a third factor, which is psychosocial factors and kind of lifestyle as well. So you have individuals that normally go outdoors quite a lot before they had dementia. So then it would be interesting to see if these individuals would be more at risk for getting lost. But unfortunately, that was kind of beyond the scope of our study. But yeah, it's an interesting point that you raise. And yeah, psychosocial factors is something that needs to be considered in future studies as well.
And then a question from Ian Harvey. Do you think there is the potential to gather data from control groups to really firm up your conclusions about the environmental factors? So, for example, looking at the environment around the matched control group of people with dementia who have no history of getting lost.
Yeah, so I actually didn't include it in the presentation, but for the police data study, obviously we looked at the 168 different locations that people with dementia went missing from. And to back up that, we also generated a set of 168 control locations that had a similar urban to rural distribution as the missing people locations, and it fell on similar types of land as well. So we had a group of 168 well-matched locations to the locations people went missing from, and we found out that where people went missing from compared to these control locations had increased landmarks, complex road network structure, and so forth. Yeah.
And then this is more comment, I think, from Ellie Young, also the effect of how long people had lived in an area being a risk factor.
Yeah, so we actually have collected data on this. So we have information on how long individuals have lived at that current address when we were carrying out the study. But yeah, I mean, of course, we haven't looked into this in too much detail, but of course, the effect of staying in a place for a long time, I mean, would you then be at lower risk for getting lost? Or if you move from one place to another, I mean, even people without dementia can feel a bit disoriented. So yeah, it's something that needs to be looked into, but yeah, we haven't looked into that as a part of our studies just yet.
But there is a big factor of familiarity for sure, how familiar people are with the places. But we know that people, of course, even when they're highly familiar in a house, that they can even get lost in their own house and cannot find the bathroom, for example, anymore. It's quite a common phenomenon. Then another question from Sapna. Would you say the landmarks were a proxy for a more legible environment rather than high crowd places?
Yeah, I mean, we weren't able to look into that factor too much because the police data was retrospective in nature. But one kind of thing that occurred to me was that these could actually be areas that are actually highly crowded. So people may tend to go missing from areas that have a high crowd. So it may not just be the landmarks and road network structure that's contributing to this. It may also be potential psychosocial factors in these regions as well.
Great. And then we have a question from Peter. Excellent. You initially stated over 65 as an age. Could you please clarify? My wife was younger and to start would get lost and later just wanted to leave the property. Also, are there any gender differences?
Yep, so it seems to be two questions in one. So yeah, so I initially stated over 65 as an age, but there are kind of rare cases where you see people getting dementia at an age that's much younger than 65 as well. With regards to any gender differences, for the studies we carried out, we didn't actually split it down into genders. We just looked at that group as a whole. But in the police data study, we did do some demographics risk factor analysis that I unfortunately couldn't include because of time constraints. And what we found there was that individuals with dementia that go missing from domestic home residence settings were more likely to be female than male. And male people with dementia were more likely to go missing multiple missing times compared to female people with dementia. So yeah, there are some gender differences that we just scraped the surface of with our analysis.
And then a question from Rebecca Stenberg. How did the persons regain their orientation in the moment?
So I assume that's referring to the GPS movement tracking study. So yeah, because it was retrospective, we retrospectively obtained information on whether these individuals were disoriented or not. We don't know how they regained their orientation, unfortunately. But when we asked the carers if these people had disorientation, it was across the whole 2-week period. So it might have just been that they were with the carer and the carer had to correct their navigation for them. So we asked this as well. Did you have, if there weren't any explicit moments of getting lost, were there any moments where you had to correct their navigation? And the carers of those 6 individuals had said yes to this as well. So we can speculate that it was the carer that intervened.
Yeah, just to say as well, there is a really, I like it, there's a comparison which I do very often, is you have to imagine that it's basically like going on a holiday you're in a foreign village or town, and you have to imagine 2 different towns or villages, one where, for example, one church tower in the middle of the marketplace. Even if you don't know the town, you will always find your way back because you have this one church tower, you can orientate yourself. But now imagine a town which has maybe 20 church towers. You would not find your way back to the center of town, to the marketplace, because you're so lost of all the landmarks. And I think that's something similar what happens actually in people with Alzheimer's disease. But it's a great question, how do they reorientate themselves? So we have another question from Ellie Young. Was there any information about time of day that people were getting lost?
No, so for the police data study, so the data that the police provided to us, there was no time of day, unfortunately, but what we did have instead was time of year. But we found that there were similar numbers of people getting lost across all 4 seasons. So that was for the police data study. And for the GPS movement tracking study, no, we didn't have information on time of day. We simply had a yes or no answer from the carer as to whether they got lost or not. And partly the reason why we don't have more detail is because this was an idea that came to us after we had collected the data. So we had to call up the carers retrospectively and get this information. So yeah, there are limitations as to the type of detail that they were able to go in for that. But the final study I talked about, the one where we test out their navigation abilities, both in VR and in their own neighborhoods, I mean, yeah, we have information on what time of day that was held. And once we finish analyzing the results of that, we can potentially look into this factor of time of day and people getting lost a bit further.
Great. And then Ian Harvey has another question. Have there been any psychological-based studies to enhance navigational skills in early dementia? Are there any candidate interventions of this type to basically improve navigation?
Yeah. So there are some very early studies that have been conducted using VR to try and train the navigation abilities of people with early dementia. So specifically, there is a stage before dementia known as mild cognitive impairment, and people in this stage are highly likely to go on to develop dementia. So there's been some studies here and there that have been conducted that try and see if they can improve the orientation abilities of people with mild cognitive impairment. But like most of the other studies, the conclusions are pretty much, they're inconclusive. So some studies show mild improvement, whereas other studies, they don't show any effect. So yeah, there needs to be looked into more.
I think it's a really important point. I agree. Also, we don't know how medication yet affects this. It's a very new area in that sense. I think this concludes actually the questions we're having here on the chat. Just lots of positive comments, which is lovely. If you have any other questions, I'm just posting our email address in the chat. So you can email us at any time if you have any questions which might come up. And also you can have a look at our website, which again, I put the link on here. On this website, we will have a recording of this talk, so you can actually watch it all back if you wanted to. There's also our previous meetings and our next meetings, which brings me very nicely to having a look at our next meeting. And just to say, our next meeting is on the 3rd of December this year, again at 2 p.m. UK time in Zoom. And it's Giulietta Camino, who is an occupational therapist and PhD student, and she will look at a different and tidier kitchen. Can people with dementia perform tasks in a new environment? So she looks in particular, how can we let people stay more independent in kitchen? How can we see how people functionally work in that domain? So we hope you can join this as well. I think it will be a great presentation. And again, any details you will have on the website or email us and we can send this to you. And thank you very much for joining today. We hope it was informative and helpful. It's always still an odd format, I have to say, these kind of online meetings, but we're all getting more used to it, I guess. And we hope to see you at the next one. So thank you for joining, and you can leave at any time you want. Thank you.